Hello everybody, thank you for joining us today for a joint CIEEM webinar on earned recognition, improving outcomes for VATs and stakeholders. I will shortly hand over to the panellists who will introduce themselves to you, but before I do, I'm just going to mention that we will be doing a big Q&A session after the presentation, so please do pop your questions into the Q&A box and we will look to answer these during the Q&A session. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Rob to start the introductions. Thank you, Rob.
Thank you very much, Christy. Welcome, everybody. Thank you very much for signing up for the webinar. We've got a great turnout, which we're really pleased about. My name is Rob Cameron. I work for Natural England. I'm the Principal Advisor on licensing in our Sustainable Development team. I'd like now to hand over just to the other panelists to introduce themselves.
Hi there, I'm Jan Collins. I'm Head of Biodiversity at the Bat Conservation Trust.
Hi, I'm Sally Haynes. I'm the Chief Exec at CIEEM.
Hi there, I'm Madeline Ryan and I'm a Senior Advisor in Wildlife Licensing at Natural England.
Brilliant, thank you very much. We also have with us on the panel and handling our questions today, Kit Stoner of Bat Conservation Trust and Lisa Kerslake representing CIEEM. But I should also mention that there are other members of the project group working with us on earned recognition: Hazel Carter, Kat Walsh and Jared Benton in Natural England, and Stephanie Ray also working with us representing CIEEM. And we should acknowledge in this important webinar that Stephen Rudd has been working with us over the years that we've been working on earned recognition and has made an enormous contribution to it. The project is a partnership between Natural England, the Bat Conservation Trust and the Chartered Institute for Ecology and Environmental Management. The aims of the project are to design a scheme to streamline the mitigation licensing process for bats in England and maintain professional standards in this work and improve outcomes for bats. We're running this webinar as we launch a consultation on the earned recognition project. The aims of the consultation are to gather your views on the proposed scheme and to inform a pilot that we're running in 2021 and to identify individuals who could potentially be involved in the pilot. The format of this session will be a presentation, but we hope to leave a good amount of time for questions at the end. The session will be recorded and the recording will be circulated to those who couldn't attend. And the recording will be made available on the partner websites. Next slide, please. So, why do we need this project? Why do we need to explore introducing a new system? The current system requires the content of all bat mitigation licenses to be checked by Natural England, the regulator. It's a very resource-intensive process, and it's a challenge for us to maintain our service standards because of that. And when we can't, that presents a risk of delay and uncertainty for applicants. The numbers of bat license applications grow year on year, and within the current system, with these growing numbers, it's difficult for us to target effort at the cases which present greatest risk and to ensure consistency of standards across all the applications that we receive. Amongst other things, the resource intensiveness of checking applications can detract from the resourcing of compliance checks as well. All of this makes it important to consider whether there are other alternative systems which would be more efficient and better at managing risk. Next slide, please. And on to the next slide as well. Sorry, back one slide. We've already applied a system of earned recognition to class licenses, the BAT mitigation class licenses and BATs in churches class license. And these have reduced handling time. They've increased certainty and given us an element of flexibility. However, the number of license applications has continued to increase. It's not been reduced. These accreditation systems, BAT mitigation class license and the BATs in church class license, work on the basis of recognizing track record and the quantity of work which has been done, but they don't reward the quality of work, and they do not secure and maintain high professional standards to the extent that we could rely on them as a means of streamlining a much broader range of license applications. Next slide, please. The Earned Recognition Project proposes a scheme whereby professional ecologists involved in mitigation licensing are rigorously assessed against a detailed competency framework and only accredited to carry out mitigation work if they pass the assessment and prove their competence. The process for submission and assessment of mitigation licenses will then be streamlined for those who are accredited. In many cases, site registration will be issued quickly and only a small percentage of cases will be subject to manual assessment. We've spoken about this project at various CIEEM conferences and BCT's Consultants Forum at the National BAT Conference over the last few years. We ran a consultation in 2017 and received around 200 responses, which showed real positivity towards the scheme. But this is the first time we've been able to present more detail and give you the opportunity to comment on it. I'll hand over now to Jan to provide some more of this detail.
Thank you, Rob. Can we have the next slide, please, Christy? Okay, so firstly, go back one. Thank you. Okay, so firstly, I'm going to talk about the earned recognition accreditation levels for BAT mitigation licensing. And I think it's important to say that we've spent some time developing this scheme, but we do want to gain your feedback from the consultation, so some of it might be subject to change. Next slide, please, Christy. So for the purpose of the scheme, we've split the UK's bat species into 3 groups, with common and soprano pipistrelle and brown long-eared bat in group 1. And the Annex 2 species, grey long-eared bat and elkathoe in group 3, with the remaining species in group 2. Next slide, please, Christy. Thank you. And there are 3 levels of earned recognition accreditation in the proposed scheme. So level 1 accreditation, which we have up on the slide here, covers projects that present the lowest risk to bats and to bat populations. And this level includes feeding and night roosts of group 1 or group 2 species that are used by small numbers of bats. It also includes day, transitional and occasional roosts of group 1 species, again used by small numbers of bats. And it also includes mating sites of common and soprano pipistrelle, again used by small numbers of bats. And finally, we've got thresholds in terms of the number of species and the number of roosts involved in a project. So level 1 accreditation includes projects where the total number of species is less than 4, so that's 3 or less, and where the total number of roosts is less than 8, so that's 7 or less roosts. So next slide, please, Christy. Thank you. So level 2 accreditation includes projects that present a medium level of risk to bats and bat populations. and it includes feeding and night roosts of group 3 species, day transitional and occasional roosts of group 2 or 3 species, and hibernation, maternity, and satellite roosts of group 1 species. And there are some exceptions. So for example, where feeding and night roosts are larger for group 1 and 2 species, they would be included in this level. And the same for where group 1 species roosts are larger day roosts, they would be included in this level. So we do have some more detail in the table that we've provided for the consultation. The thresholds for this level are that the total number of species would be less than 6, so that's 5 or fewer, and the total number of roosts would be less than 12, so that's 11 or fewer. So we'll go on to the next slide, which is the level 3. Thank you. So level 3 accreditation includes projects that present the very highest level of risk to bats. So that includes hibernation, maternity and satellite roosts of group 2 and 3 species, mating or swarming sites of any species except for common Osprano pipistrelle, and then any roost that's related to, in or related to a nationally or internationally designated site for a given species, or that has potential to qualify as a designated site for that species. Any site that relates to a nationally significant infrastructure project, any roost of high conservation significance, which is again defined in the documentation that's been provided with the consultation, and any other type of roost or habitat feature that's not been mentioned within these levels that I've described. And lastly, the threshold. So this includes projects where the total number of species is 6 or greater, and the total number of roosts is 12 or greater. So next slide, please, Christy. Oh, sorry, actually, I've got a little bit more to say on that one. So as I said, the levels are described in the table that's been attached to the consultation. There's more detail in it, but we anticipate that many ecologists, will require only level 1 accreditation. Some will require level 2, and a very small number of people that are working in the highest risk situations will require level 3. So we'll move on to the next slide, please. The project team have identified a set of competencies that are relevant to bat mitigation license work, and it's based on CIEEM's Competency Framework. So it's divided into technical competencies, which require bat-related knowledge and skills specifically, and transferable competencies, which are knowledge and skills that are common to many professional activities. So it's these competencies that will be assessed through the accreditation process. And obviously, if you're a member of CIEEM, you'll be familiar with the competencies because they're part of the existing competency framework from CIEEM. Next slide, please. Just before I start talking about the competencies and listing them, I wanted to say a brief word on survey skills and licensing. So the ER pilot is for bat mitigation licensing only. There won't be any change to existing requirements for registering or re-registering for a bat survey license. But the ER project has got the potential to raise standards and recognise competence in all areas of professional bat work. So the competencies described for bat mitigation, bat mitigation licensing encompass skills that are key to effective and accurate bat surveys, even if some of the activities are not licensable and some are covered by survey licenses. Just a note also that advanced survey techniques are not included at this stage. So the pilot will enable the project partnership to test competencies assessment and the accreditation process in relation to survey work. And we are considering whether and recognition could incorporate survey licensing down the line in addition to mitigation licensing. But if we were to go further with that, there would be a consultation with stakeholders at the time. So for the moment, nothing changes in relation to survey licensing. So moving on to the competencies, Christy, thank you. So the ones listed on the slide relate to survey work. As I said, these are included. And we've got on here survey design, planning and field work, species identification and handling, habitat survey, and physical environment survey. So we'll move on to the next slide. So next on the list of competencies, we've got the ones relating to mitigation. And there are four elements here. So the first one is providing advice. The next one is designing mitigation. And then we've got implementing mitigation, and then risk management during project implementation. So next slide, please. Thank you. So lastly, on the technical competencies, we've got ecological impact assessment. So that includes preliminary ecological appraisal, preliminary roost assessment, and ecological impact assessment. We have advising on the requirements of policy, legislation, and standards, and interpretation and evidence-based reporting. And I've got one more slide on transferable competencies. Thank you. So these are skills that everybody should be operating with. They go across the board, across all the levels of accreditation, and they include elements like professional conduct, communication, collaboration, client and customer care, project management, management of documents and data, and of course, really important to back survey work, to back work in general, actually, health and safety. So I'm going to hand over to Sally to tell you about how the ER accreditation levels and the competencies knit together within a framework.
Thanks very much, Jan. Can I have the next slide, please, Christy? Thank you. So for the consultation, we've gathered the competencies together in a table. This is known as the Competency Profiles document. Next slide, please, Christy. So here are just a few sample rows from the Competency Profile table. And I've deliberately picked one competency from the survey section, one from the mitigation section, and a transferable competency to give you a flavour. The table provided with the consultation includes all of the competencies that were listed in the previous slides. So all of the technical competencies are coloured green, and the transferable ones are coloured blue. There's a column which gives the label of the competency, and then there's a column which describes what the competency covers, and then the expectation for each accreditation level. So you can see that for survey competency, which is the first row, those with level 1 accreditation should be able to carry out surveys for all species in a range of situations. The expectation at level 2 is that ecologists should be able to manage more complex situations with higher risk, what we're calling a medium level risk. And at level 3, ecologists should be able to manage the most complex and high risk situations. For the mitigation competency, which is the second row, this table refers back to a separate document provided as part of the consultation, which is the accreditation levels table, and that defines those 3 levels of risk, levels 1, 2, and 3. And for the transferable competency, which in this case we've used professional conduct, the same is at all levels, so that all ecologists will recognise good practice standards and demonstrate ethical behaviours and maintain their professional competence. So that's the same at all levels. You may be wondering why there are orange and yellow cells in the table. So next slide, please, Christine. So I'm going to move on and talk in detail about the competency framework. Next slide, please, Christine. So levels of competence. The earned recognition scheme recognises 2 levels of competence, capable and accomplished. In CIEEM's competency framework, we also recognise basic and authoritative, but we don't need those relevant for this scheme. So the definitions are that for capable level competence, that means you can undertake straightforward activities and tasks to a good standard, consistently well and without supervision. So all of the earned recognition accreditation level 1 competency profile, which covers most of the scenarios found in development projects involving bats, requires only capable level competence. You might be more accomplished than that, which is fine, but it only requires. For accomplished level competence, you can undertake more complex activities and tasks, or those involving a high risk to bats, consistently well and without supervision. Indeed, you may supervise others. But in general, you're working in projects that require greater application of professional judgment in order to secure good outcomes for BATs and for your clients. Both the Earned Recognition Accreditation Level 2 and 3 competency profiles include some of the technical competencies at the accomplished level. Next slide, please, Christy. So if you move on to the framework itself, and I should say we've only included for the consultation, we've included one of the competencies in detail for you to focus on to get an understanding of how it works. We haven't included the whole thing. So we have columns for the competency and for the description as before, and then we have a series of indicator activities, which are the indicators of competence. And these cross-reference to Bat Conservation Trust professional training standards. And then the last three columns, there's a tick in each of the relevant earned recognition accreditation level columns to say whether it's required or not. So a tick means it's required. So the competency framework takes the broad competencies identified in the profiles document and then drills down into these indicators of competence. So these are the specific areas of knowledge and skill that, when correctly applied, demonstrate the required level of competence. So in this particular one, we're only showing you the capable level competencies. And please note that it assumes that if it's required at level 1, it assumes that it's required at levels 2 and 3. Next slide, please, Christy. So carrying on down, we can see that there are then accomplished level competencies, which are the ones in orange, which then are only relevant to levels 2 and 3 of the Earned Recognition Accreditation. So we do appreciate that this may sound a bit confusing, especially if you're not a CIEEM member and you're not used to this competency framework approach. But it's just too detailed to show you the whole thing in this consultation. So as I say, we have included within the consultation documents this one example, text 6, designing and preparation of management, mitigation and enhancement plans and projects. Next slide, please. So the Earned Recognition Scheme has also been designed to align with the latest edition of Bat Conservation Trust professional training standards. I'll hand over back to Rob, please. Next slide, please, Christy.
Thank you very much, Sally. Thank you, Christy. So I'll take us through some other components of the Earned Recognition pilot listed in this slide. When people apply for accreditation through this scheme, we will assess applications in line with an assessment strategy, and that will be a mix of online and field testing, assessment of a portfolio, and a professional interview, and of course in current times we will have to design this assessment strategy with COVID restrictions in mind. The applications will be assessed by assessors. They will all or mostly be external to Natural England, and we will appoint a lead assessor to ensure consistency across the board. In addition, there'll be an expert panel which will be made up of renowned authorities. It will act as a sounding board for us in conducting the pilot, and it will hold us to account to ensure that the design of the scheme is robust. There will be a class license central to the pilot, and that is what will establish the assessment and accreditation as a requirement and give access to a streamlined site licensing process. That site licensing process or site registration process will ensure that the legal licensing tests, those covering purpose, no satisfactory alternatives, and the favourable conservation status test are met. It'll be a streamlined process which requires the registered professional to declare whether survey, mitigation, compensation and monitoring have been carried out or will be in accordance with specified guidelines. such as the most recent editions of the survey and mitigation guidelines. And this process will rely on accreditation as one of the means of assuring the quality of this action. The assessment process will sift. This refers to the handling process for following submission. Site registrations where the accreditation level of the applicant does not match the level required for the species and roost type, which may be present, will be rejected. Where site registrations are for low and medium levels of risk and published standards have been followed, confirmation will be issued quickly. For those sites where published standards have not been followed, or for high-risk sites, a manual assessment will still be needed. However, this will be streamlined with a focus on the particular areas of risk within the site registration. Compliance and enforcement will be an important part of this system, and will need to be both proactive and reactive within the pilot period, and if the system is rolled out as business as usual afterwards. For the pilot, we do not expect to charge for accreditation assessments, but we do expect to charge for site registrations, but we're reflecting on this currently. We've not fixed the charging policy yet. Next slide, please, Christy. So on to the consultation process itself. Next slide, please. The information about the scheme and the links to the 4 key documents are provided on the BCT and CIEEM websites. The websites provide a link to the SurveyMonkey questionnaire for ecologists, which is the format for the consultation. There are 44 questions in total, 19 mandatory and 25 optional detailed questions. We're asking that you respond to these as an individual rather than representing the views of your company or organization. At the end of the SurveyMonkey questionnaire, there is an opportunity to express an interest in being involved in the pilot. Priority for the pilot will be given to those who have taken part in the consultation and expressed their interest in being involved. And we will select a sample of participants which represents a wide geographical range, size of business and level of experience. This will ensure that the pilot can effectively test the scheme and inform wider rollout if the decision is taken to implement the scheme as business as usual. A separate and less detailed consultation is being run concurrently for other stakeholders. This is also linked from the partner websites. It's shorter, only 11 questions to answer. It would be great if you could circulate the relevant links to your development related contacts so we get a maximum response to that. Just to recap then, next slide, please. Just to recap then, the key benefits of the scheme are improved outcomes for bats through better practice and enabling improved compliance and enforcement, streamlining of the mitigation and licensing process for bats, reducing delays and uncertainty in many cases, and by enabling us to shift resources, improving outcome monitoring and compliance monitoring. And finally, we expect it to raise and maintain. So that concludes the presentation. Would you just move on to the last slide there, Christy? If you have any queries or issues after this webinar, then please use the email here, and the address is the email address is provided here, excuse me. We'll now move into the Q&A, which will be managed by Lisa and Kit.
Rob, could you just go back to your previous slide and just go through that again, because we lost you for a while there, please.
Sorry, there was a glitch on my phone. Thanks for saying that, Sally. Can you go to the slide after that? The queries and issues slide. I think you missed.
No, it was the previous slide actually, Rob, where we lost this one. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Okay, thanks for saying, Sally.
Just the last few sentences, really, Rob. Just the last couple.
Okay, well, this slide sums up. It sets out what we think will be the key benefits of the earned recognition approach. Improved outcomes for BATs, streamlined mitigation licensing process. By enabling us to redeploy resources, it should help us focus on higher risk cases and improve monitoring. And the accreditation process, we expect to raise and maintain professional standards. Okay, can we go to the next slide, queries and issues? If you have any queries or issues after this webinar, then please use these email addresses and we will attend to any questions you raise. So now, let's move into the Q&A, which will be managed by Lisa and Kit.
Thanks, Rob. As you can imagine, we've got lots of questions coming in. I just want to reassure you that we will be answering all of them afterwards and publishing the responses to those. So if you don't get to your query in this session, don't worry, we will answer it and we'll be publishing the Q&As on both the websites. We have had 4 questions submitted ahead, so I'm going to start with those. The first one I think is probably for you, Rob. So the question is, the proposed scheme looks fine in principle, but given that Natural England currently struggles to resource licensing, and in my experience very seldom carries out any compliance checks, is it realistically going to be possible to properly resource the necessary level of monitoring of competency levels and survey mitigation? I realise that this is the hope, but has this been realistically modelled and costed?
Thank you very much. There was a glitch in the line, so I'll just check that question is how we will ensure that we achieve good levels of compliance monitoring. So we are modelling this. This is part of the purpose of the pilot. If we can reduce the resourcing required for double checking the content of applications, that should enable us to shift resourcing to compliance effort. But this project, this earned recognition project, is part of a broader program of projects, and there is another project which is about planning and ensuring that we achieve the appropriate levels of compliance monitoring. So this pilot is essential to enable us to see how the resourcing pattern changes with this scheme in place and enables us to plan ahead.
Thanks, Rob. I think the next couple of questions are probably both for Maddie. They're about the scenarios in the consultation. So the first scenario given in the information document mentions surveys carried out across the active season as per the guidelines. Yet in practice, we still see a great many reports where all surveys were carried out over a short period and sometimes all outside of the appropriate survey season. As a BAT group that is consulted by our LPA, we usually advise rejection of such applications, but clearly in other areas they are often accepted, perhaps because the LPA lacks an ecologist and presumably get through the EPS licensing system. Are you able to comment on that, Maddie?
Yep. So the proposal is that where survey guidelines are not followed, the case would be then picked up for some level of assessment, so it wouldn't pass through the new system automatically. But this will rely on the consultant submitting accurate information in the site registration application. So where a consultant states that guidance has been followed and a subsequent compliance check finds that this is clearly not the case, then that would be subject to enforcement action. Enforcement actions haven't been defined yet, but could involve a range of sanctions depending on the severity and could ultimately result in being deregistered from the licence. We are also aware, which is what the question is getting at, that we need to account for situations that are based more on judgment, where it may not be clear-cut whether guidelines have been followed or not. So, for example, if you wanted to survey to detect presence of a maternity roost in a structure that's got high suitability, you'd be recommended to do 3 dusk and dawn surveys during May to August. And BCT guidelines note that these surveys should be spread out and spaced at least 2 weeks apart. And obviously one consultant might say that 3 surveys carried out in the last 2 weeks of August is acceptable, and another might say that that's not acceptable. And that might also vary according to the species that might be present. So we're aware of that issue, and that it will need to be taken into account in how the system works and what guidance will need to be provided as part of that. It will be really important that consultants can be completely confident in the answers that they give when they're completing the site registration application.
Thanks, Maddie. And then another common question on the second scenario. I was surprised to read in the second scenario that it was considered perfectly in order to base a licence on 1 out-of-season inspection survey as long as precautionary mitigation was employed. This seems to undermine the necessity for seasonal surveys as specified in the guidance. It's unsurprising that consultants are sometimes confused.
Right, so this scenario presents a situation where one of Natural England's licensing policies is used. These policies were brought in at the end of 2016 to provide more flexibility when obtaining EPS mitigation licenses while still meeting the licensing tests. Now, scenario 2 is presented as a simplistic situation, so most licensing policy cases are more complicated than this in reality, but it is in line with the application of licensing policy 4, and this policy allows non-standard survey work, but only where certain criteria can be met. It's not the intention of the policy to undermine survey standards, and it's not the case that a developer can simply opt out of doing that survey work. And when proposals come to us that don't meet the criteria, they are rejected. What the policy does do is recognise that there might be circumstances where non-standard survey and uncertainty in survey results is acceptable under certain circumstances, and where mitigation and compensation can be put in place that covers the reasonable worst case scenario that might be present at the site. And for all licensing policy applications, we do recommend engaging with chargeable pre-application services before submitting a formal license application, so that consultants can get some advice on whether their situation is likely to be acceptable or not before applying.
Thanks, Maddie. And then the final question we've had submitted, but it does overlap with a couple of questions that have come in through the question and answer box, is around the relation of earned recognition qualification requirement to be a member of CIEEM or a similar body. The main criterion context with ER is about having the experience as it was in the low-level impact licence. The membership of a professional body is centred around the code of conduct rather than the experience. So there are a couple of questions around this. One is, if a person breaks the code and is expelled from the organisation, then it follows that they would potentially lose their ER status. Would that be the case if they were just reprimanded? And as a sort of secondary question is, what about good experienced VAT ecologists who are not members of a professional body? This requirement appears to me as bordering on a closed shop or even a discrimination scenario. And there's some concerns around the previous low-level impact VAT licence, where this person didn't qualify to be a registered consultant because they weren't a member of a professional body, but they had concerns that some of those who were getting that registration didn't have as much experience as them. And that should go to Sally, I think, if that's okay, Sally.
Yeah, no, that's fine, Kit, thank you. Well, I think there's some very important and interesting points there. Unfortunately, experience doesn't always equate to competence. Certainly in terms of CIEEM members who may have been found in breach of the Code of Professional Conduct in relation to VAT survey mitigation, they, in cases, are very experienced, but they're not necessarily demonstrating much competence. And there are a number of factors which influence competence, and the level of experience is only one of them. I do understand people's concerns about belonging to a professional body. We've tried to make it clear that it doesn't have to be CIEEM. There are other professional bodies which people could choose to be members of, and one of the things that Natural England will be doing will be looking at other professional bodies and ensuring that they have the the right requirements and the competence to deal with VAT-related issues, but certainly there are others available. I think a good professional body doesn't seek to exclude members unless there are very powerful reasons for doing so. When members are found in breach of the code, then the idea is to help them address those shortcomings through, for example, further training, mentoring, and so on. So we're not looking to stop people practicing. We're looking to encourage and support them to practice to the required level. Ultimately, it'll be Natural England's decision as to whether or not somebody is still able to be included in the Earned Recognition Register. But certainly from a professional body point of view, wherever possible, we're looking for members to address the issues that have caused them to work to insufficiently high standards and improve.
Thanks, Sally. Right, we have a lot of questions. So Lisa, would you agree we just sort of start and see how far we get? Yes. Okay, right, let's go. I think the first one, a couple, probably likely to be Maddie or Jan. So I'll let you decide between the two of you which ones who wants to answer it. So we've got, are any of the levels likely to take into consideration or have thresholds for the number of bats using the site, as opposed to just the number of species or roosts which were mentioned?
We have considered including numbers of bats in the table, but it doesn't actually make much of a difference to the levels that the different species fall under. The only distinction really is between the feed-in roost and night roost of group 1 and 2 species, which could fall into accreditation level 2 if larger numbers of bats are involved. But yeah, it doesn't make a massive difference to the whole scheme. I don't know, Maddie, do you have anything to add to that?
I just wanted to add that so any roost that's of high conservation significance would also automatically then fall into level 3. So whatever the species and roost type was, so this would be sort of maternity and hibernation roost typically. So even if that's a more common species, if that's, for example, an exceptionally large roost, that would still come under level 3. So it is taken into account in that way as well.
I guess the thing to point out also is that the numbers of bats does vary regionally. So it is very difficult to define this within one table that's supposed to work across the whole of England. So yeah, as Maddie describes, the high conservation significance roosts are covered and would fall into the higher level.
The other thing I would say is if you do think that that's something that should be taken into account, then we would like to hear about it in the consultation response.
Okay, I'm just going to ask the next one because it's kind of linked, and then I'll hand over to Lisa. This is a Maddie one again, I think, is how would a site being relating to a designated site be defined?
That's quite a good question. At the moment, that's generally up to the judgment of the ecologist to decide and identify that situation. This might be something that we need to provide a bit more guidance on potentially, but yeah, we haven't got that detail yet.
Okay, I'm going to stay on the subject of NSIPs because I've had a few questions in about why is a higher level of accreditation required for them if in some cases you might have just a couple of small low impact situations like a few pit roosts or whatever, why we're actually asking for that higher level of accreditation. It's maybe something we haven't fully looked into yet, but it's a question that's come up a few times.
Maddie, I'm going to let you do this one because you described it so well in our discussions.
Did I? Yeah, it's funny. This is something that has moved in and out, I think, as as one of the additional criteria. NSIPs are a good way to capture the most complex and most high-risk projects that are happening. We do appreciate that there might be the odd situation where there is only a low impact roost present in a site. However, because of typically the size of NSIPs and the type of impacts that might be experienced, we also need to ensure that the consultants dealing with that are able to identify, are they actually able to identify accurately what offences are going to be committed and what impacts overall are going to be committed? Can they accurately do that? And we feel that the nature of most NSIPs mean that even if ultimately you end up with just a single common pipistrelle roost being impacted, that it needs to be the higher accreditation level that organises the survey work and the impact assessment in particular as a whole. But again, this is something that we would welcome comments on in the consultation.
Okay, thanks, Maddie. A couple of quick ones. Firstly, a couple of people have asked whether they, in applying for this, when and if it eventually comes into place, whether they'd be able to use Welsh or Scottish examples in providing their evidence for accreditation.
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, I'll take that one. Yes, I think so. It's not something we've discussed, but we're looking for evidence of competence, and the country in which that competence has been deployed isn't really an issue. It's the competence in relation to the competencies that's what we're after.
Thank you, Sally. And then a couple of questions on accredited agents, which is firstly, will we still be able to use accredited agents? And secondly, if so, will they have to go through the same process? So we can only use an accredited agent if they've actually been accredited under this scheme, if you see what I mean.
I'll take that one. This isn't something that has been decided yet, but my anticipation is that accredited agents will be able to be used in the scheme as they are currently for the BMCL, for example. As to whether they will need to be accredited themselves, I don't think that could be the case. But that's something that we will think about a bit more.
Okay, thanks very much, Maddie. I'll ask one more and then I'll hand back to Kit. So just to give you a little bit of chance to prepare, Kit. So a couple of people have asked about the similarity to the current VAT mitigation class licence and whether anybody who currently is registered for BMICL will have to go through the process too. Which I'm assuming the answer is yes, but I just thought I would open that up for somebody to confirm.
Yes, people would have to go through the assessment and accreditation process for this scheme because it's different from the VAT mitigation class license scheme.
Okay.
Anybody wants to add?
Straightforward answer. Answer is yes.
Thanks. Thanks, Jan and Rob.
Okay.
Kit, do you have any more?
Yeah, I've got plenty. So I think it might be Shan possibly on the planning side, but the question is, we've run into real issues with LPAs and BMCL, particularly with respect to the derogation. How will you roll this out to LPAs so they understand how the licenses will be issued?
I think that's a really, really good point. We do have a separate consultation for other stakeholders, including LPAs. So we have sent that out far and wide. So hopefully people, LPAs, will be aware that we're looking at the system, we're piloting it next year. But you're quite right, we need a good way of publicising what we're doing to LPAs and also, potentially providing them training so that they understand the system properly. So yeah, it does need to be considered down the line. Absolutely right.
Thanks, Jan. I think the next one's probably Sally. Please can you comment on the liability for license implementation? Does this now fall on the ecologist rather than the client who is the license holder? And if so, can CIEEM comment on any insurance implications that ecologists should be considered?
I think the current sort of insurance provision should be adequate in terms of public liability and professional indemnity insurance. In terms of the liability, it comes down to what advice, evidencing what advice you have given to your client, and making sure you've got good evidence of that. You cannot control your client, but you need to be able to demonstrate that you've given competent and appropriate advice, and that's really the liability that you have.
Okay, thank you. And then, sorry, one around the species and the competencies. So the all species might be tricky for some to achieve under the competencies, particularly for the rarer bat species. Or is it a case of being accredited for all species listed in each group? I'm guessing that's probably Jan or Maddie.
Maddie.
In terms of the all species, you would only need to be, in terms of the competencies, you would only need to provide evidence for the species and roost types relevant to the accreditation level that you're applying for. So all species might be relevant for the survey competencies, for example, but if you've already got a level 2 class license for survey, then you should be able to demonstrate that you can survey for all species, for example. In terms of whether you need experience, which might be what the question is getting at, whether you need experience for all group 1 and group 2 species in mitigation and compensation to qualify for level 1. The precise criteria for the different levels hasn't been finalised, but I think the expectation would be that you would need to demonstrate competence in mitigation and compensation for a range of the species that are included in group 1 and group 2, not necessarily every single species that's in those groups.
Thank you. I think this one's probably for you as well, Maddie, I'm afraid. So for level 3, where the roost relates to nationally significant infrastructure projects, would this include roosts which would otherwise be counted as level 1 to 2?
Yes.
Easy. Actually, find another one quickly. If you fulfill some but not all of the requirements for a given group, for example, you've got competency with some but not all the species in group 3, would you still have the option of pursuing a normal license?
If the decision is taken to implement this scheme fully in the long term, then the intention would be eventually that it would replace the current bat mitigation licensing system. So eventually, and this there would be a very long lead-in time to this, but eventually that route would be closed. So you would need to go through the new system.
Okay.
Did I do a couple? Okay.
Yeah, far away, yeah.
Okay, right, a couple of CIEEM or professional body related questions. So these are for Sally really. A couple of people asking again why we have to be a member of CIEEM, which I know you've more or less answered given the question that came in before, but one specific was to do with what other professional bodies would be acceptable under this situation, because we should stress that it isn't just membership of CIEEM that will be required, it's membership of an appropriate professional body.
Yes, so one of the things that Natural England will be doing will be looking at other relevant professional bodies and their code of conduct and their competence to inquire into issues relating to bats. So for the pilot, I think we need to take a broader approach, but should the scheme eventually get to the point where it is rolled out, then by that time and in good time, I think there will be a list of relevant professional bodies that is made available. Is that fair, Rob?
Yeah, I should add to that we will ensure that we keep other professional bodies informed of the progress of the pilot and give them the opportunity to explore with us how they can get involved. So
they have been told
that commitment.
So.
Okay, thanks, Sally and Rob. A couple of others. I've had a couple relating to numbers and size. Apologies if some of this has been answered before. So one is, will there be a definition of explanation as to what we define as a small roost or a small number of bats? And there was also a question from Laurent right at the beginning about size of roosts. So, you know, numbers of bats as opposed to just species and roost type. I don't know who wants to take that, Jan, maybe?
I think we already answered that question.
Okay.
That second one, I think we've already answered that. The first one about, is there going to be a definition of small numbers? The BMCL uses this idea of individual or small numbers of bats as well. And there is a bit of guidance in the BMCL on what that means. So we might use the same kind of guidance, or we might try and potentially to define it a bit more closely, but obviously it is difficult to take account of every single species.
And regionality as well.
Sorry, what was that?
And regionality as well.
Yeah, thanks for that. Question here, which we may not know the answer to yet, but so possibly one for Maddie. How long will the ER be valid for? For example, after 2 years, would it be necessary to be re-evaluated?
I think we probably anticipate that there might be something like an annual requirement to demonstrate that you've still got the required competencies, but the precise way that works hasn't been decided yet.
Okay, thanks, Maddie. There's one here, I don't think this has been answered, but about making reference to the most up-to-date survey mitigation guidelines and pointing out that the current mitigation guidelines are very dated and need to be updated, which we can obviously say that process is going on at the moment. Sally, I don't know if you want to comment on that.
Absolutely. We have a draft revised document which is currently being commented on by members of the advisory group. I hesitate to say when it will be published, but it is an advanced draft. So hopefully in the not too distant future, we'll be publishing an updated version, which has been thoroughly and very expertly supported by all the statutory nature conservation bodies in UK and Ireland, and Bat Conservation Trust, of course, and various other bodies as well. So hopefully, not too distant future, there'll be a new version.
I guess it might be just worth mentioning that the survey guidelines we had intended on a next edition by next spring, but that's been put back because of working on this project actually. So we're looking at spring 2022 for the next edition of the survey guidelines.
Thank you very much. It is 2 o'clock and I know I actually have to go, so I don't know whether that's...
Lisa, thank you for saying that. We have run out of time. It's been a very useful set of questions for us to think about. It just remains for me to thank everybody who's dialed into this webinar, and to Simon BCT for setting it up. We look forward to collaborating with many of you through the course of this pilot. Thank you very much.